The Spotlight brought to you by Beacon Plumbing.
Good evening and thank you for joining us for The Spotlight. I'm David Rose. Just how long is the long arm of the law? This week, a 52-year-old Renton man found out. Marysville police caught up with him for the axe murder 24 years ago of Jennifer Brinkman. This is a murder mystery we've been following for almost that long.
Against this wall on the left-hand side was the bed, a single bed that was against that wall and against the far wall. And Jennifer was lying on the floor on the right-hand side of the bed.
That was Marysville Police Detective Dan Vinson, whose work on advancing this case was invaluable, according to his police chief. Vinson kept Jennifer's memory alive and the investigation ongoing, allowing technology to catch up. When Brinkman's father came home from vacation and found her body, he also found the axe that the killer used to slit her throat. Investigators found DNA on the weapon, but they had no way back then to find a match. Enter Parabon Nanolabs, which in 2020 got its hands on the sample. And using a process involving genetic genealogy, they were able to link a suspect to this horrific crime. Police have identified him to the spotlight as Jeff Primo. This is his Facebook page showing that he lives in Renton, which is where he was arrested earlier this week for murder first degree.
It's a good feeling. It's really a bit overwhelming, actually. Jennifer's father passed away in 2013, so we weren't able to provide him that closure before he passed away, but we're very thankful that we were able to come to a resolution for Mom.
Right now, a motive behind the murder remains unknown, but Jennifer is believed to have met Primo through phone dating services or chat sites online. Police say she had a minor developmental disability with the mental capacity of a 13 or 14-year-old girl. Primo is being held on $250,000 bail, and the spotlight will continue to follow his case in court. Parabon Nanolabs was the game changer in another case that's getting a lot of attention right now. November marked 35 years since a young couple from Canada disappeared during a visit to Seattle. Within a week, both of them had been found murdered. 18-year-old Tanya Van Kuylenborg's body was dumped in Skagit County. Then, on Thanksgiving in 1987, hunters discovered 20-year-old Jay Cook's remains in Snohomish County. The case remained unsolved until 2018, when the killer was finally identified as William Talbot, aka Bill. A genetic genealogist at Parabon named C.C. Moore used his DNA profile to build a family tree from public ancestry databases. Talbot became the first person convicted by a jury in a case nationwide involving genetic genealogy. He was sentenced to life in prison. Now, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author has just released a new book on the double murder called The Forever Witness.
Inside a police evidence room, there's evidence that is in effect a witness to crimes that never fades, never lies, never forgets. It is literally a forever witness that's just waiting to be uncovered and tapped to solve these mysteries.
Edward Humes was living in Seattle when William Talbot's trial started in 2019. He watched the court proceedings and was drawn into the case because of the human side of the drama. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Kuylenborg left Vancouver Island in his father's bronze 1977 Ford van on November 18, 1987. They were headed to pick up a part for his dad, who had a heating supply and repair business.
So they take this drive, cross over to Port Angeles from Vancouver Island, and then drive through the Olympic Peninsula. Their goal was Bremerton, to take the ferry to downtown Seattle. And somewhere along the line, they crossed paths with a killer, and they just vanished.
It was Tanya's first road trip.
She was 18 years old. She was just a few months out of high school, a budding poet and photographer.
When she didn't call and check in, her family knew something was wrong. A week later, their remains were found 65 miles apart. They'd been abducted in downtown Seattle and murdered. In his book, Humes details the decades-long effort made by Snohomish County Sheriff's Detective Jim Scharf to solve this case. We talked with Detective Scharf several times about the murders as far back as 2009.
Jay's body was found below High Bridge, which was on the Crescent Lake Road. Tanya was taken up to Skagit County, south of Alger, and she was shot and raped and left by the side of the Parsons Creek Road.
Their van was found a few days later near a Greyhound bus station in Bellingham. For decades, Detective Scharf worked every lead, even locating a lens at a pawn shop in Portland that had been on a Minolta camera stolen from the van. But the big break in the case didn't come until genetic genealogist C.C. Moore with Parabon Nanolabs was sent a DNA profile of the killer. It was developed from semen samples found on Tanya's body.
Based on the list of people who shared promising amounts of DNA with the subject file, I was able to build family trees back.
Moore used the public genealogy database GEDmatch to identify Talbot.
He was definitely never a suspect. There was no reason for him to be suspected. He had no connection to the victims.
Talbot had been living in SeaTac and driving a truck for a living.
It's interesting that he lived a very sort of secluded life. He wasn't present in any social media. He disguised his true address from, when he filled out forms.
But as he and so many other killers have discovered in recent years, all it takes is a family member curious about their origins to put them in prison. For families of victims like Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg, genetic genealogy is a blessing.
Science and good old-fashioned police work is making it harder and harder for these disturbed individuals to hide in the shadows.
I think it's imperative that the public, we support the use of the DNA databanks for law enforcement purposes.
But Humes also points out that anytime you take an ancestry test, you're also essentially crowdsourcing solving crimes without even knowing it.
We need to have a national conversation about where this is going in the future, whether these databases should stay in private hands, which is unusual for a forensic database, or whether there should be a public project to create a law enforcement genealogy database. That conversation is just starting.
Last December, an appeals court overturned Bill Talbot's conviction, but it had nothing to do with the DNA evidence. They cited juror bias. Snohomish County prosecutors appealed the ruling to the state Supreme Court and are awaiting their decision. If the overturned conviction stands, Talbot would still face a new trial. He remains locked up. A DNA match isn't a magic wand that instantly solves the mystery. When we come back, the crucial and painstakingly detailed work that begins before a big break in the case. It all starts in the murder room.
I'm just happy I got to live long enough to see this happen.
Genetic genealogy is giving hope to so many parents of murder victims who've waited decades for justice. Because of advancements in forensic science, killers who thought they got away with it are now paranoid that the next knock on their door will be the police. The arrest, though, is just the first step. Alan Dean was taken into custody in 2020 for the murder of 15-year-old Melissa Lee in 1993. She had been drugged and abducted from her home in Snohomish County. Her body was found in a ravine in Everett the next day. Multiple investigators worked on this case over the years until Detective Brad Wolvatny used DNA from a discarded cigarette and genetic genealogy to identify Dean. At the time, it was the third arrest of a suspect for murder in Snohomish County using genetic genealogy. The 64-year-old was living just a few miles from Melissa's home back in 1993 when she was killed. After his arrest, though, a judge dismissed the charge and ordered Dean to be committed to Western State Hospital. Fast forward to this past October, and Dean was back in court, charged again with Melissa's murder. He's now awaiting trial, and he's being held on $2 million bail. To solve a case like the murder of Melissa Lee, Detective Wolvatny says he goes back to the beginning to meticulously build a timeline.
In our office, we have what we call red books, and those red books are the detective copies. And then we have an original file. Yeah, so this is basically our bullpen, and here are all of our red binders of our cold cases that we currently have active. Once all these get reconciled, we're going to get them all scanned and uploaded digitally so we have access to it on the computer rather than paper form. As I started digging through, for example, Alan Dean's case, found original documents in the working copies. Or I'd find originals where they should be in the original file, but a copy wasn't with a detective copy. These folders are all of our originals. So what I'll do is I'll go page by page and I'll reconcile, cross-reference. I'll make sure that everything in there matches what's in here. I put a P So that means I only did a photograph of it. If I went down here and I did an O, that means I opened up that package. And I could tell it's been down to the lab twice, because you have one up here and one down here, and then an original seal. So after the detective sealed this up as evidence, this package has been opened twice.
Okay.
Okay, so this is important to us, chain of custody, right?
What's in there?
This is just right fingernail clippings from the decedent at time of autopsy.
Did the lab find any DNA back then?
No. So just an example. Another example, one that I went in there and I made a photocopy of everything because, and this happened quite a bit with Melissa Lee because there's a lot of documents when we processed her bedroom. She had a calendar in there, she had notebooks in there of, she kept a diary of what she did every day, who she was hanging out with. And Alan Dean's name appeared in some of those documents. So it's pretty exciting. You never know, again, what might be in a notebook.
What if you find something with blood on it in one of the envelopes?
Then what I would do is I would generate a new item, and I would remove that item, I would document it, I would remove it, I'd book it as a new item, and then submit it.
It's incredibly detailed work, though.
It is. I love it. It needs to be done. I am identifying all my witnesses, like in this case with yellow. So I want to be able to go through the case and find out, have all these witnesses been contacted? Have they been interviewed? Because believe it or not, a lot of people identified during these cases and they statements have not been obtained.
What does red mean?
So red, I identified in this as possible evidence in this case. I want to know if that has ever been submitted or tested. And then when I have the time, then my next step is do the lab submissions and the results. Then I go back to here and I say, okay, this was submitted for lab. That's my process of how I make sure that all potential evidence that I see, that my belief is evidence, has been examined.
Why not just see what DNA you have, send that off, and then if you get something back, then maybe do all that work?
Yeah, it's unacceptable. I mean, is that fair? Is that fair to the state? Is it fair to the person of interest that we arrest for this? I mean, we're not gonna do a half, what kind of job. We want to be thorough. When it goes to the private lab, what we're dealing with that is centimorgans. So basically that just identifies the measure of the relationship. You share 50% of your mom's and 50% of your dad's DNA. And you go back a step to your grandparents, this cuts it in half, 25%, 25%. If we get centimorgans back to, a range between 1,300 to 2,300, you're dealing with a half sibling. Anything between 2,300 and 3,900, you're dealing with a full sibling. So this is the kind of stuff that the genealogists use, and this is what they work off of when they build their trees and try to figure out the strength of the relationship.
And then they go and use public records and find out, just like you would do if you were tracing your ancestry, and then build it all the way down to where you have a couple of likely suspects.
Absolutely. Marriage licenses, divorce decrees, social media is a huge thing. You can go into people's Facebooks or Instagrams and click on things and seeing who people are and who they're related to. So genealogists, they use all that stuff.
What's that like to come into work and you have an email and it's from the genealogist and they say, we think this is your person of interest?
It's very exciting, and the work is just going to start right there.
Goes from cold to very active.
Very active. Once we get the word from the genealogist saying, hey, like your person of interest is this individual here, you want to find out where that person's at, because what you want to do is to obtain, their discarded DNA to get that confirmation of what the genealogist is telling you.
What's it like to be able to look at a suspect and say, not did you do it, but I have proof that you did it, that you were there?
When we had Alan Edredine in the interview room, and he chose not to talk to us, and I told him that he was under arrest for the murder of Melissa Lee. He just stared at me, and we walked out of the room, and within 30 seconds he looked up at the ceiling and he said, I'm sorry, and he made a comment that he knew that will, why we had him there was the reason why.
Still to come, a closer look at how all this science actually works. We've gained access to one of the most successful crime-fighting labs in the world. The detective work in so many cases is being done at Othram Labs, where the mission is justice through genomics. The Spotlight got an inside look at the lab that's been cracking the coldest of cases all across the country.
Othram is the only lab in the world that is purpose-built to use forensic genomics to get inputs from intractable forensic evidence and identify perpetrators and victims from crime scenes. You can imagine when you find a body out in the wilderness, that body is in bad condition. There's a lot of non-human DNA with it. It's decomposed. Sometimes it's burned. I mean, we've worked with all sorts of remains. And we're able to take those intractable inputs and create a DNA profile that looks like a DNA profile that would come out of a swab from your mouth or your blood today.
This instrument is called the NovaSeq 6000. It's manufactured by a company called Illumina. It's about the size of a washer machine. This is the most powerful sequencer in the world. It's got a giant camera and it's taking photographs of every step of you building a DNA molecule, one letter at a time. And it takes a bunch of pictures, and these pictures can then be deconvoluted to tell you what letter was added. So you put all these little molecules on there, and you can read what the letters of these molecules are by essentially indirectly measuring what the letter is when you synthesize the strand next to it.
We upload our DNA profiles to genealogical databases that are purpose-built for law enforcement use, like ours, DNA Solves, or ones that have been consented for law enforcement purposes. And then we are able to fit that piece back to where it belongs in a family tree. So we'll know that there's a match that this is this far away here, and a match that's this far away here, and a match that's this far away here. And then we can figure out exactly where that person fits in that genealogical tree and give you the identity of the person that was at the crime scene.
If you've left DNA at a crime scene, you're already caught. We're just working our way to you.
For our technology, you don't have to be in any database. Everyone is interrelated enough to the databases that exist right now have enough people in them that you don't have to be in it. None of the relatives you know or come to Thanksgiving have to be in it, and you're still able to be identified. And that's the amazing part of the technology, is we can identify anyone.
We've been focusing on advances in comparing DNA evidence, but how about collecting it? The Washington State Patrol is using new tech that's a far cry from the swab and swish method made popular by detective drama shows. Introducing M-VAC. If you think it looks like a souped-up wet-dry vacuum, you're partially correct. But this vacuum can suck in material that is much, much smaller than your upright can do. It can actually bring in the tiniest trace amounts of genetic material off virtually any surface or object.
The FBI did a study that said it was 1,400%, collected 1,400% more DNA than swabbing and cutting. I mean, that's a huge amount. And you can get off of things you can never get off before. You get off rocks, you can get off tape, both the back and the sticky side, and you can get it off money, you can get off anything.
WSP now has 8 M-VAC units available, and while the technology is still relatively new, it's proven quite capable of helping in some very old cases. In fact, there's one in Texas where the M-VAC got a hit off a 43-year-old piece of clothing. Detectives then used that DNA to solve a child rape and a murder case that had long gone cold. Up next, time travel and a Tacoma cold case. Detectives go 20 years into the future to search for a missing child. Even with all the advancements in forensic DNA technology, detectives still rely on tips from the public, tips from you, to solve cases. Antonio Neal was 22 years old when he disappeared in December of 2016. 3 years later, his foot washed ashore on Jetty Island in Everett. No other remains have been found. Snohomish County major crimes detectives are still asking for the public's help to find out what happened to Antonio, and so is his mom. She knows it will be hard to determine how her son was killed without a tip.
At least I know he has moved on to a better place, and he can rest in peace, I hope. But I won't stop fighting to find out what happened to him.
Antonio was last seen on December 12, 2016, leaving a home in the 2400 block of Cedar Street in Everett. His Jetta was found a few days later in Linwood. Detectives say they know he got into a physical fight with somebody before he disappeared, but they need much more information. So if you can help, please contact the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office tip line at 425-388-3845. And it was nearly 23 years ago that a Tacoma mother put out a plea for help to bring her missing daughter home. That plea is being amplified by the Tacoma Police Department tonight as they release new information as they try to find out what happened to little Tika Lewis. The 2-year-old girl disappeared from the New Frontier Lanes bowling alley on Center Street on January 23, 1999. And now, for the very first time, Tacoma police say a maroon or dark-colored Pontiac Grand Am was seen leaving at a high rate of speed from the bowling alley right after Tika was noticed missing. Detectives say that car was a late 80s or early 90s model. And here is a new age progression of what scientists believe Tika would look like today at the age of 25. Tika's mom, Teresa, says she was overwhelmed when she saw it for the first time.
Well, when I first seen the photo, my daughter Katerina was there with me when I opened up the email, and I cried because after all these years, they finally made a picture that looks like my daughter. We'll never give up. That's one thing I won't do.
Now, Tacoma police say they're also still trying to identify a person of interest who was seen at the bowling alley, described as a white man, 5'11", with a husky build, shoulder-length curly brown hair with a thick mustache, and a heavily pockmarked face. Crime Stoppers of Tacoma Pierce County offering a $1,000 reward for any tips that lead to an arrest of the person responsible. Call 1-800-222-TIPS. Well, that's all the time we have for you tonight on The Spotlight. Until next time, be smart and stay safe.